Radhika, welcome to the Thriving in the Age of Disruption podcast series. We're so excited to have you here. I thought it'll be really great if you can start off by introducing yourself.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here. My journey, it was across many continents and countries. I grew up in India till I was 12, then lived in South Africa during South Africa's most historical times, I guess, from 91, which is right after the apartheid laws were abolished, until 95, which is right after the first democratic elections were held. And then I moved to the US. I did my undergrad at MIT and grad, and then I've been in Boston since, except for I lived in Singapore for a short while, which I absolutely loved, and I'm really looking forward to being in Singapore again. But my journey across all of these countries was entrepreneurial in many ways, in that, first of all, it was always involving, moving into the unknown. When we moved from India to South Africa, we had never seen the country when we decided to move there. Similarly, actually, when we moved from Boston to Singapore, we had never been to Singapore. We decided, we'll move there, and it'll be an interesting experience. So that kind of reminds me of entrepreneurship in many ways. It's this jump into the unknown, right? Actually, while I was still at MIT, I started my first startup. It was called Lobby 7, along with 4 other co-founders. And what we built at the time was what you can now think of as a very earlier version of Siri, meaning we did voice recognition on devices so that you could interact with your devices using voice as well as text. But this was like back in 2000, well before 3G, which was the most exciting thing at the time, well before iPhones and so on. So we built our first startup, but we were entirely too early to market. So our company was acquired, but we didn't get a huge payout out of it at all. But that was the start of my entrepreneurial journey. And what I realized is that, it's this entrepreneurial mindset that you carry into every kind of a role. And so from there to other startups that I've worked at, or even large companies, my role was always entrepreneurial, even within larger companies where we were launching a new product or creating a new product or growing it. And then finally, this entrepreneurial journey brought me to Radical Product Thinking, which is the book that was published in September 2021, so last year. Radical Product Thinking is really about how do we create change in the world through our products. And that is really kind of the essence of product thinking, but also of being an entrepreneur.
There are so many points that I want to respond back to. And from what I gather, you sort of headed out to the US in 1995. And
Yes.
That would have been around the time when I was in the US, about 1992 in the beginning, when I was there for the exchange program. And then later in 1995, when I'd gotten married. The US at that point was at the cusp of this whole World Wide Web and the technologies that were coming out of. And in early 2000, I started my first startup company. And it was a phenomenal journey because in 12 months, we had raised millions of dollars. We were looking at listing the company. And I had at one point thought I was going to be a billionaire then. And then I ended up a year later, actually liquidating the company because 2 things had happened. One was there were some issues within the company that I had to sort of confront was inconsistent with my own value system. The second part was, of course, the dot-com crash was also happening. But the failure was really also a good lesson for me because, when you go into a business and you expect it to succeed, it's a different kind of journey. And when you go into a business and eventually you fail, it's a different kind of experience as well. And I often wondered at that time, what was I ever going to do with my life? And when I look back now, I see that, entrepreneurship was a way of life, and it was not just that destination or that company. And it's sort of something that you're saying. I think entrepreneurship is also about disrupting change. And I love the fact that you've taken that whole notion around your book and your thought leadership with radical product thinking, where you're talking about how do you create change in the world through our products. I'm really intrigued. Can you share a little bit more about it?
One of the things that I really wanted to address through radical product thinking and how you can create change is this notion in the startup world, which stems from toxic masculinity, this idea that change is created by, one or two visionaries. It's these visionaries who are almost always white and male. And it's this idea that someone top down tells others what to do, and that's what makes you a visionary, and everyone else is just executing. And that's really, really not how entrepreneurship works or being a visionary works. The other idea, which also comes out of a few unicorns that have succeeded, is this idea that, to build a successful product, all you need to do is just throw something in the market, see what works, just keep iterating, and you'll figure it out along the way. The reality is, even when you have a treasure chest, a war chest, you really have 2 to 3 pivots before you run out of money or momentum. So you can't keep just trying an infinite number of things to see what works in the market. Those are the two ideas I really wanted to challenge in the book. So the examples, first of all, that I use in the book are of people who have created profound change in the world through their products. They've affected people's lives, but in a positive way, and they've created world-changing products. And these are people who are, of all, ethnicities and races and, people around the world. It's not a Silicon Valley centric view. The second idea that I challenge in how we create change is that it's not just based on let's just try things and see what works, but rather that we can be vision driven and create change very systematically. What I mean by that is, as an entrepreneur, you have to think about your product as a mechanism of creating change. So meaning that the end goal of the product is not just the product itself. It's not the success of the product in itself. It's really first thinking about what is the change that you're trying to bring about? What's that? And it's not disruption for the sake of it. It has to be a certain intended change that you want to bring about. And then your product has to succeed in creating that intended change. So once you start thinking about it in this way, you can start to apply the ideas of radical product thinking to be able to engineer that change systematically. And in the book, I talk about the 5 steps of engineering change, which is the first step, starting with a clarity of vision. The second is translating that into an actionable strategy, like the strategy is basically a set of actionable steps. Then the third is translating the vision and strategy into priorities, then into execution and measurement that's hypothesis driven. And the last element is culture, so that you create the culture that you need in your organization to have this mindset and innovate efficiently.
What you were trying to address in the book and to challenge the notion that, that any kind of successful unicorn business has been driven by white male, and that, everyone else is excluded from that journey. And I think we have the same versions of that in Asia as well. And so that's a good way to challenge. And I have observed, at least in the case of this new rise of technopreneurs, it's been really people who are already well connected, traditionally, either who come from big families, big family businesses, or with large networks. So they may not be necessarily from the technology space, but have that deep connection. At the end of the day, creativity is not just about 1 or 2 people in an organization, but it's about, unleashing that from everyone else within the organization. The second piece is also to challenge this notion that, wow, suddenly as a unicorn, you've become so successful, so focused on fundraising. But we forget then what is the real product or service that we are building, And how are we going to deliver that value? And if nobody is going to give us the money, how are we going to sustain the company, right? Then entrepreneurship becomes just one facet of fundraising to ensure survival.
Exactly. Those are diseases that I talk about in the book. Like one of the key diseases that we catch when we do that, you talked about fundraising and that becomes the measure of success. That's hero syndrome, where we feel like it's all about just being big and go big or go home. When you so obsess over that, that you forget what's the problem you're solving. And the other thing is when we're just focusing on, oh, let's just keep iterating and we'll find our way, that disease is pivotitis, where we just keep pivoting. It's more like whiplash and, you really lose your way. And that's where you run out of money and momentum.
I suffered from both those things with my first startup.
Oh, absolutely. Same here, These are all hard lessons from experience. No shame in declaring these diseases. They're so common.
That's right. Okay, so, I want to go back to why I think entrepreneurial mindset is important. I think that in this world of disruption where, we are facing uncertainty every day, I have found that as an entrepreneur over time, that being resourceful, that i.e. as in being able to deal with a problem and knowing how to look for solutions, or even to, first of all, define the problem so that it is the right problem that we are trying to solve. And number two is having a healthy attitude towards managing risk as well as uncertainty. And number three is being really focused on creating value, just not for ourselves, but also for our stakeholders, is actually what I would call is an entrepreneurial mindset. And I wanted to get your opinion about that.
I completely agree that this entrepreneurial mindset is just so important to thrive in today's environment, right? And what you described earlier about having this clarity of, what is the problem you're solving? What's the value you're adding? This is so much of what I talk about, that when we build a product or whatever we start out doing, right? If we're applying this entrepreneurial mindset, we have to start with this clarity of, why do we even need to solve this problem? Like first defining what is the problem, why does it even need to be solved? And then finally, we can say, okay, so this is the problem. This is who has the problem. This is why the world is unacceptable if we don't solve it. Now, we create this alignment and this clarity of purpose. This becomes a mindset that you can apply anywhere. Why must it be solved in the world? That becomes super important. And, you were asking, how do I apply this? It was really funny. My kids were playing a board game once. And I heard my daughter saying to my son, you can't just pick cards at random. You need a vision, a strategy. So I can only hope that this is one lesson that they apply beyond board games. And that this is a lesson, in life.
But that's really great, because if we had that vision and we held on to it, it doesn't matter what kind of action that we take today or what we have to change tomorrow, because the vision will guide us and keep us on track. So that's a very important piece.
And, to your point, it's so hard to be a leader who's really giving your team, because when we don't have this clarity of vision, we're making decisions for our team and telling them what they need to do. On the other hand, when we have a clarity of vision, then we're able to balance it against the reality of short-term business needs. Because when we're making decisions, what we're constantly doing is we're thinking about, how am I balancing the long term against the short term? So unless you have clarity of vision, I like to think of it as the yin and yang. If you don't have that clarity of vision, you're just completely moving to the dark side.
That's right. I run a boutique consulting firm which does corporate culture change. And that's usually 3 to 5 years. And we sort of have to juggle between, which is to create that long-term vision and then have these short-term milestones that the company is having confidence in meeting, and seeing that they're actually altering their performance and results over time. 5 years down, they've actually accomplished far more than what they said they were going to do, because they're working in tandem with that long term and the short term. But it's a struggle. It's a struggle sometimes to get team members who may not feel that they are owners of the business, to give their 100%, to own that vision down to what they're doing day in, day out in their jobs.
Yeah, and I think there are two aspects to this. So one is people across the organization taking ownership of the vision. That's one. The second part of this is leaders actually empowering people to make decisions and communicating the rationale of how they trade off the long term against the short term. So the first aspect of this, right, when I mentioned getting people to internalize the vision and make it their own, this is the piece where, I go back to the toxic masculinity of, how we think a good vision should sound. We've heard that a good vision has to be broad, aspirational, never changing, that it has to be something that's, in the US, you keep hearing this term, it has to be a BHAG or a big, hairy, audacious goal. And, to me, a vision has to be absolutely none of the above. On the contrary, that vision has to be detailed, and it has to articulate the who, what, why, when, and how. Like, whose problem are we solving? What is the problem? Why does it need solving? When will you know it's done? How are you doing it? It's more like an essay than a slogan. And so the way we, what I advocate for in radical product thinking is, don't worry about the words. It's this fill in the blank statement. Really work on answering those deep questions. The most important part is, don't just do it as a leader. Do this as an exercise with your team. Get them to think through the who, what, why, when, and how. And so the leader and the team thinks about this vision for the company, but you also need a vision at a product level. So, every product team creates and writes their vision in this who, what, why, when, and how, fill in the blanks format. And you make sure that it aligns to the top level. But the point is that, this way you cascade the vision up, all the way from the company level down to the teams. And this helps people understand, how does this apply to me? What do I do with it? That's the first part of it, right? Getting people to internalize the vision. And then the second part is actually giving people the autonomy to balance vision against the short term. So the way I like to think about this is using a 2x2 matrix that I like to draw up, which is where your y-axis is vision fit. So is this good for the vision or not? Because now that you have this clear vision, you can actually determine if something is a good vision fit or not. And survival as a startup is most likely financial survival. But if you're in a big company, it might be support from your stakeholders or your bosses. And so you can evaluate, is this good for the short term or not, right? And so things that are good for the vision and for survival, those are what I call the easy decisions. Mm-hmm. Those are the easy decisions, but if we always just stick to the easy decisions, we're being only short-term driven because we're constantly thinking about survival. Sometimes we have to invest in the vision, which is where it's good for the vision, but not good in the short term. Mm. And the opposite of investing in the vision. So an example of this is where, you need to win this big deal, and customer says, you have to build this feature for me. And so you grudgingly say, okay, fine. But you have to recognize that as vision debt, because, if we just do these things over and over, it leads to the disease I call obsessive sales disorder, where we kind of forget about the vision and all we're doing is just thinking about survival. And so, making decisions is, as a leader, not just telling people what is the right trade-off, but rather using this 2x2 to communicate how you're thinking about trade-offs, so that when you're not in that meeting, when your developer is in writing code and thinking about how they're going to write this, they're making the right trade-off. When your engineering managers, your salespeople, they're all thinking about trade-offs in the same way. this is the communication that needs to come from good leaders who have this entrepreneurial mindset, who are communicating this clarity of vision and how to make decisions.
Wow, I love that. That's a really elegant framework to think through what people can do in the implementation of a vision in their day-to-day jobs. And, I just wanted to also share, as I was listening to you as the entrepreneur 20 years back or 22 years back, when I made the decision not to do the listing, I could see that, I was dealing with the vision fit. We had the prospectus ready. We needed to get the sign off of board members and shareholders. And one shareholder wanted additional shares. And that to me was like corruption, bribery. And I couldn't deal with that. And I decided that I was not going to list the company. And if it meant that I had to close down the company, I would do that. So in that moment, it was not just long-term, it was short-term, it was everything, right? And to your point, we can use it personally in our lives as well, because that's that simple y-axis and x-axis decision-making in a nutshell.
You just said, it's so beautiful. What you did back then was investing in the vision, right? And it's such a huge decision that you made. And that was a big investment in your personal vision of what you thought was right or wrong. And, I feel like if we're being mindful about business, it's really thinking about this vision versus survival for ourselves as well, right? And being mindful about the decisions that we're making. I feel like sometimes it's so easy to look at the work that we're doing and just think about the little piece that we're contributing to without thinking about the bigger picture. And I'll give you an example. There's a really good friend of mine who had a job offer from one place, and she was comparing job offers. In the end, the place where she chose to go work was Google, right? And kind of the way she was thinking about it, she was like, well, I'm only working on identity verification. So it's very easy to look at your own little piece and forget about sometimes what is the digital pollution that it is creating in the world? Like, what are you actually contributing in the world? Like, what is the change that you want to be part of? And that is kind of our personal vision versus survival that we need to think about. Very often our job, sometimes we need to question, is that truly a vision fit? Like the change that entire product might be bringing to that world, is that a good vision fit for you? And there are no right answers, right? Because these are all hard questions. My ask of people is to think about your own vision fit or survival so that we can be mindful in the decisions that we make, because the reality is we vote with our labor, and you have to choose where you want to place that vote.
That's so powerful. We vote with our labor, just like we vote with our money, where we want to spend our money, right?
And, increasingly, it's become harder to vote with our money, right? Because when you have big tech, you sometimes don't really have a choice. I was booking flight tickets recently. I can't vote with my money. Honestly, the choices were so few. I'm kind of stuck with this is it. And increasingly, I'm realizing when we can't vote with our money, really the only option we have is to recognize that we can vote with our labor and to recognize that as a society and want to change that.
Yeah. And I think, the younger generation, they realize that. And that's why we talk about the Great Resignation, and we talk about, jokingly that the millennials and the younger ones are not really committed to the voting with their labor, because they don't want to do jobs that are just jobs. They want to have meaningful and purposeful lives. And I think, that's the shift that we are seeing today.
I think, a lot of Gen Z, they don't have the kind of optimism about the world that, I think we had, you and I, growing up, right? Because when we were growing up, that was the golden age of technology, where we had this belief that technology is going to create progress for humanity, that the world is only going to be better because of technology. And I was talking to a few kids recently, and what was shocking for me was their disillusionment with technology, where they were saying, well, we don't believe that technology is making the world better. And in fact, a lot of these kids were saying that when they grow up, they would like to either foster or adopt, but they would not want to have their own kids because they don't want to bring kids into this world. And that I was shocked by, right? I had never had these ideas when I was growing up. And so this is, I think, some of the responsibility that I think all of our listeners, like everyone has. We have to create a world where we're not fraying the fabric of society, that the technology, the products that we put out are actually creating a better world that works for all. That's how we create progress for society, right?
Let me just move on to another important mindset that I view in this age of disruption, and that is having a crisis-ready mindset. I define crisis as a setback. And I think it's critical that we understand how to deal with crisis, which can be a personal setback or even a global situation, because we are dealing with change, and sometimes when change is unmanageable, that is, it is beyond our own coping mechanism or the kind of resources that we have, we may feel stuck. And I've had those situations in my life, whether it was in running the business or it was personal life, as in my divorce or in my relationships breakdown. And so what I wanted to also do here was to ask you, I'm sure you've had setbacks in your life or failures, and how have you dealt with that? And what had you get back into the game? And, if you have a personal mantra or a practice, that'll be great if you can share it with our listeners.
I think in terms of setbacks for me, dealing with it has always involved having a support network. And being able to have people that you can truly rely on and completely be yourself with, be your authentic self with. I think, for me, sometimes there was one place where I was working, and it was really such a toxic environment that it was, that was a huge setback in my career. And I felt like, having to just leave so abruptly from such a toxic environment, it made me question a lot of, should I be doing something differently, or kind of what went wrong there? And I'll give you one other example of setback that I found, that it took me a long time to process. As I was working in my career, there were times when I was passed over for promotion. And what happened was, every time I noticed when I quit a job, the person who was hired after me was, first of all, a male, white, came in at a higher salary and a higher title. My question was always, what did I do wrong? So in terms of setbacks, the first thing is honestly being introspective and seeing what can I do differently. A lot of the elements, of what I've learned, taking this facilitative approach, sharing rationale, sharing this clarity of vision, etc. A lot of the leadership skills that I've learned have come from these setbacks, because you realize that you have to be so much better as a leader to be able to fight for what you feel like you deserve. So being introspective, because there's so much you can learn from it. But the second piece of it is really to not internalize failure. Because, like you were saying, there are so many things outside of your control, and being able to distance yourself from that feeling that you have failed. And that part is super hard to do. And I think as part of this, mindfulness, when you're on the happy path and everything is going well, mindfulness during that time takes the edge off a little bit. It helps you kind of accept and manage and cope.
Oh, okay, great. So what I'm hearing is that, it's important to develop a support structure, a network of trusted people, be it family or friends, so that you can, talk to them and share with them authentically what you're dealing with. Two is developing the practice to actually introspect. It's almost like taking personal responsibility for what you did or you didn't do that might have caused this situation, so that, you don't have to keep, blaming yourself or the situation, but you can at least come to peace with it, right? And number three is very important not to internalize the failure, because, yes, the business might have failed. Yes, you might not have gotten the job, but that's not about you. It was just that opportunity and it didn't show up. It's like a feedback of that situation. And the last piece is, which I find really intriguing, because, you talked about actually being mindful of the happy moments. Like, it's almost like if you are mindful of the happy moments, even in a bad day, you could have a happy moment just because you saw someone smile, or you ate something you like, or did something that in that split second gave you happiness that you are now mindful of. And then that that whole day is just not that bad day. It's got that happy moment too. Is that what you meant?
I actually meant that when you're in a happy state, if you can practice mindfulness, then it's so much easier to be able to be mindful when you're in tough times. Starting meditation when you're dealing with hard times is much harder as a practice. That's what I meant. But I love what you suggested. I think that aspect of being present and experiencing every moment, and realizing that there's joy in all these little things, I think that's such an important reminder. I think that's really beautiful. Thank you for sharing that.
You're Let's now explore spirituality, and where are you in your spiritual journey?
Okay, so I discovered meditation about a year ago, and it's been really transformative for me. It's been really helpful. It's transformative in the sense that it really helps you kind of be more present. I guess it's something to be experienced and it's harder to describe, but just the ability to feel in touch with your consciousness, that you are not your mind. That part was really, I think, very powerful, to be able to separate kind of this thing where, I am who I am, this consciousness, but it just happens to be in this body. But each of us, like, we are more than just these bodies. And this realization that, we're all here to love and be loved.
So it is really the exploration of how, you're not separate from the universe, or you're not separate from each other. And, being part of the collective, how do you actually find peace, being also yourself?
What you described is so beautiful. I try to say some of these words to my husband sometimes, and he says, okay, you're just throwing a bunch of words together, but I don't understand what you actually mean. But you repeated back some of the same things that I tell him.
I actually had an interesting experience when I was in the deepest moment of my personal crisis. In 1997. And I remember that I'd just come out of the shower and I was looking at myself in the mirror. And I really got that, I am me, irrespective of what roles that I played, because at that point I was confronting the fact that, I was not mother, I was not daughter, I was not employer, I was not business owner. And so if I didn't have these roles, then who am I? It was like, oh my God, I just got that I am me. And it was earth shattering. And to remind myself of that moment, I kept then shaving my head bald for about 10 years maybe. But then I found that I became addicted to doing that because the very moment you shave your head, it's fine. Then 4 hours later, as you know, the first bits of your hair starts creeping back, you know, that whole ego and that whole experience of being attached comes back. But, you know, I was trying to recapture for myself that emptiness. And then I realized that it was not the emptiness as much as just knowing that, you know, I don't need to get attached to who I am just because I have these roles to play, or I have these positions that I hold, or I have these physical things. And it just had to be bringing more and more awareness to that, so that, you know, every day I could practice it in different forms. So
it's such a beautiful moment, right? This feeling of I am. But it's one of those things where you kind of have to experience it through meditation. And then you kind of wish you could experience it all the time. But the more you seek it, the more elusive it is. And you kind of have to just practice meditation regularly without seeking to just kind of be at peace, right?
that's right. That's right. Yeah. So anyway, and do you think that it is possible for us to live a simple life? And what is a simple life for you?
Wow, I think in the age of phones constantly buzzing, and I am not good at this, right? I'm not good at dealing with our interrupt-driven life. And so I think my ideals for what is a simple life is a life where we can be present at every moment, and at every moment of the day we're feeling in touch with our consciousness, always feeling I am, and you know, feeling aware, as opposed to, you know, just blindly going about all that we go about in our day. That is the ideal simple life. But I think that is kind of what we all strive for. It's not easy, but I do feel like we can achieve it.
Yeah, and so that's the struggle, right? There is that goal that we have, or the expectation of what is the simple life. And we struggle through it, I think, partly because maybe we have not seen that there might be maybe two levels of that simple life, because in our own minds as ourselves, we can bring simplicity and be simple because it's more from a mindset. But then when we interact with the rest of the world, it becomes more complex because of, you know, the roles and the positions we have, and the obligations and the expectations that we have to fulfill on. And so yes, it becomes a striving for, right? You know, and
because as mindful as you can be, right, the moment you open your LinkedIn feed and start reading your feed, you know, there goes simplicity, and you feel like, oh, I need to do this, this, and this is what I need to achieve. And if we can kind of go back to this feeling of I am, regardless of whatever role, etc., that I hold, you know, thinking about just I am, and this bigger purpose of feeling like we're here to love and be loved. I think that is simplicity, right, at its core.
right. Great. So I've enjoyed this chat with you. Thank you so much. Sustainability, and what is sustainability for you? I mean, how does it show up in your personal life or in your workplace? So if you can share that with us.
Yeah, to me, sustainability is two things. One is sustainability in terms of Earth and what is sustainable, so that we don't incur the devastations of climate change any faster than we already are. So that's one aspect to it, but that's more spoken about. And so, you know, I think that's the typical definition of sustainability. I want to add to that definition of sustainability, where there's what I call digital pollution in my book, right? It's all the it's what we're doing to society through a lot of our products, and the change that we're creating in society. You know, the increased polarization, both in terms of wealth and ideology, the raising. Sorry, let me rephrase that last part.
Sure. I wanted to say in the meantime that, it's interesting because we in our own consulting practice also take on the definition of sustainability being one where it's the ongoing thriving of a living system. And so it's more than just the depletion of natural resources and its devastation on climate change. It is fundamentally about us as a human being because we are a living system. And how do we ensure the ongoing survival and thriving of this system? Right. And so then we have to look at the interlinkages and the interconnection with other subsystems that we operate in. And I guess, technology is one big piece.
And I want to add to the definition of sustainability. So it's not just earth sustainability, but also thinking about how we can build products without fraying our society, the fabrics of our society. So avoiding what I call digital pollution. And in the book, I talk about the different forms of digital pollution, which is, eroding the information ecosystem, eroding privacy, raising inequality, and fueling polarization. These kinds of pollution that are affecting our society as a result of products that we build, that is, unsustainable for our society, for democracies to thrive. And so that's another form of sustainability that we need to be aware of, and that we need to realize kind of how is our work contributing to it. And that's where, earlier I was talking about voting for the kind of world we want to create through our labor, like voting with our labor. That's really, if we want to think about sustainability, we have to think about not just, recycling and using water carefully, etc., but also thinking about how am I voting with my labor? What kind of a world am I creating? Is it making society more sustainable, or is it fraying the edges of society?
Wow, I like that.
To me, we have to build products that create a world that work for all. And to me, women in leadership positions, it's so important, because what we build in this world, right? What all these products we build, they affect people's lives, and it affects society. And we need more women. We need diversity, women of color as well. We need women in these leadership positions so that we can build a world that works for all. And so that's my hope, to see more women in these leadership positions being able to influence how we build, that we can move away from a lot of the toxic masculinity that has existed in the entrepreneurial and startup world, and where women can have more influence.
And if you had to use 3 words to describe thriving, what would those 3 words be?
Growth, joy, and peace. Oh,
lovely. So Radhika, I have enjoyed our conversation, getting to know you and doing this interview. I look forward to many more conversations, and hopefully in person too.
Likewise, this was such a pleasure. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.